One of Deltarune's biggest questions for me has always been the nature of Kris, and more specifically, if there's some version of a character that we've seen before. Before Chapter 5's release, one theory on the topic I considered really compelling was Kressel theory. The idea that Kris is the vessel that we made at the start of the game, but colored in with care by the Dreamers along with their friends in Hometown, and having become their own person. It not only has a good chunk of evidence to back it up, but more importantly, it would be pretty narratively satisfying and fits with a lot of the themes the game is building up. Despite how much we try to enact our will onto them, whether that be through gameplay or trying to have a hand in the creation of their being, Kris is still Kris in spite of that. It made so much sense to me that before Chapter 5 came out, I was half expecting the game to start leaning a bit more into it. But oddly enough, when the chapter finally rolled around, we didn't get a whole lot in the way of more evidence for Kressel. Instead, we got a crazy amount of parallels between Kris and this random kid. Is Kris the parallel version of the Patient Soul? Okay, so as a real quick refresher, back in Undertale, there were 6 humans that fell into the underground in between Kara and Frisk. They were all killed so that their souls could be used to break the barrier, and seeing as they all died before our little goober fell in, we don't really get to know a whole lot about them. Aside from a very few minor details and context clues here and there, none of these 6 made much of any lasting impact on the underground. We do find the armors and weapons they used during their journeys strewn about different locations, but that's about the extent of the mark they left. Well, that is besides their actual souls, which we see when Asgore reveals the containers they're kept in, along with when Flowey absorbs them. We get to see that all 6 of their souls are different colors, and through the ball game in Snowdin, we learn what traits their souls embodied. Orange is bravery, yellow is justice, blue is integrity, green is kindness, purple is perseverance, and cyan is patience. Through the Omega Flowey fight, we also get to see which weapons and armors belong to each human, which all line up with the equipment that we find throughout the game as well. But that's just about all we got to learn about them in Undertale, and they ultimately weren't much more than plot devices that were needed to break the barrier. That is until Deltarune Chapter 5. This chapter's Dark World takes place in Flower King, where these 7 flowers in Asgore's shop take on new life, representing the 6 human souls from Undertale along with Flowey in the middle. And let me tell you, I did not expect these guys to be so on the nose with the references to their Undertale counterparts. They are super explicit about their soul traits, and they all clearly use the exact same weapons and armors that they did while they were alive back in Undertale. Heck, all of them even have Omega attacks, which are either heavily inspired by their attacks from the Omega Flowey fight, or are just straight up one-to-ones. However, one flower in particular stuck out to me more than the others. Aqua. Aqua represents the cyan, or rather aqua-colored patient soul from Undertale, and similarly to her Undertale counterpart, also wears a ribbon and uses knives as her weapon of choice. She's the first flower that we get properly acquainted with, and starting as soon as our first encounter with her, I was blown away by the sheer amount of parallels between her and Kris. I'm not even exaggerating for the sake of the video either, like there is genuinely a mountain of similarities between them throughout the chapter that's borderline impossible to ignore. When we first meet Aqua, Kris is thrown into a one-on-one battle with them, the only time that Kris fights any of the flowers solo, and the only solo fight we have in general throughout the entire chapter. During the fight itself, Aqua will mimic nearly every act we do, from spinning to dancing to even just checking. It should also go without saying that Aqua and Kris have nearly identical colors in the Dark World, something that Aqua herself even calls attention to multiple times throughout the chapter. She'll point this out in their fight when she checks Kris, along with how both of them also use knives and wear ribbons, getting confused about who's who. Their designs share similarities besides just their color too, with both of them them having their eyes obscured by their hair and having a red eye in the rare moments that we get to see a glimpse of it. Once again, similarities that Aqua shares with Kris which no other flower does. Her design is also the only one of the flowers to really feature more than one singular color, being both cyan and red, possibly referencing the fact that Kris has ties to both cyan and red colored souls. Of course, the red is meant to be from the faded ribbon that she wears, but it's really interesting how she's the only flower whose armor from Undertale had an impact on the colors of their design. It's not like the stained apron was green or the old tutu was blue, and yet they were both made green and blue for the sake of their Deltarune designs. But for some reason, out of all the flowers, Aqua's bright red ribbon was intentionally kept its original color. I also think it's far from a coincidence that the ribbon happens to look a lot like a red heart, tying the red and cyan souls even further together. This isn't even a specific angle thing either. This ribbon looks almost exactly like a red heart in nearly every sprite she has. Even when she's spinning around, it looks like a red heart at basically every angle. On top of all of that, I don't think it's crazy to say that Aqua acts a bit similarly to what we know of a younger Kris, being a bit of a prankster and always getting herself into trouble, which makes a ton of sense if she's meant to be a younger parallel version of them. Even the knife in Aqua's talking sprite bears a striking resemblance to not just the attack icon in the battle menu, but more specifically the icon that Kris's weapons use. Oh yeah, and out of all the breaks you can have in the cafe with the flowers, of which there are 5 entire pages by the way, the only ones that involve Kris are with Pink and Aqua. And Pink just so happens to be another character that mirrors Kris in a lot of important ways, being composed of 2 entities merged into one, which while they initially have their disagreements and hold each other back, eventually learn to accept each other and work together. An arc that's very reminiscent of Kris's relationship with the soul, and might even have a similar resolution of us learning to work together. And again, bear in mind that out of all the characters that Kris could have had breaks with, it's just Pink and Aqua, possibly implying that Aqua is on a similar level of important parallels with Kris. Near the end of the chapter, we also see in Asgore's exposition and flashback that Kris is represented with an aqua coloring, which is by no means confirmation of their true soul trait, but it's just another piece of potential evidence that would line up. There's even some auxiliary information from Undertale that helps this case out as well. We already know that Kris has an affinity for knives, but they also start out with a bandage in the light world. And while those 2 traits may be reminiscent of 2 other particular humans from Undertale, the patient soul actually shares both of these qualities, as they're linked with the toy knife, and their bullets also turn to bandages during their phase in the Omega Flowey fight. Which, speaking of the toy knife, during the Undertale 10th anniversary stream, its location was moved to a new part of the ruins called the Abandoned Town, an area which has a theme containing the faint courage motif, aka the theme when Kris dies in Deltarune. In my opinion, this was always the most compelling piece of evidence for the theory before Chapter 5, as moving an item that symbolizes the patient soul and what remains of them in the same area that has Kris's game over theme is honestly pretty convincing. And now with all the parallels with Aqua, it just has even more credence. So with all of that being said, I think that this theory has at least some legs to stand on. This theory was around even before Chapter 5, and I already thought that there was somewhat convincing evidence, especially with the 10th anniversary stream. But now with the plethora of evidence from Chapter 5 and all the similarities between Kris and Aqua, you've gotta admit it's hard to deny that there's at least a connection here. So what would this actually mean in the context of Deltarune's story? Well, there are a couple of possibilities. The first is that Kris's original soul was patience before we came along with our red soul, which I think is generally pretty agreeable. It doesn't really conflict with a whole lot of other theories and just mainly serves serves to give more context rather than change what we already knew. For example, I can easily see Kressel still working if this is true. After all, Kris had to have a soul before we came along, and I don't think it particularly matters what Kris's original soul color was. Plus, Kris's actual soul having a completely different color from ours would be a very nice way of visually showing the difference between the two, and making it clear that we are not one and the same. Kris always having a red soul that we just took control over one day is far from impossible, but you've gotta admit that Kris having an original soul with a different color and trait would communicate the difference between us a lot more clearly. And out of all the soul traits, I'd say that patience fits Kris pretty well. They've been working in the background all this time for whatever weird night conspiracy they've got going on, patiently waiting throughout most of the game for those brief, perfect moments to rip the soul out and further their plans. They've been leading a double life for days on end now, keeping up their facade in front of Susie and Rousey while they wait for whatever plans they have to finally come to fruition. The scene in Noelle's house really sells it for me, as right when we're about to look at the shelter code inside of Dessa's guitar, Kris catches us off guard with a hockey puck, as it's revealed that they've been under the bed all this time just waiting for us. Now if that isn't patience, I don't know what is. Things get a lot muddier though when we talk about the idea of Kris not just having a patient soul, but being the parallel version of the patient soul from Undertale. And unlike the previous hypothetical, this one does disrupt a lot of other theories, and really can't coexist with other theories surrounding Kris like Kressel. People take issue with this idea specifically because they don't see what it would really add to the story. And even I have to admit that I kind of agree. Alternatives like Kris being the vessel but becoming their own person anyways would be a lot more satisfying narratively. If Kris is instead the parallel version of Undertale's patient soul, then what? Like, sure, it's kinda cool, I guess, but what does that really do to serve the story? Many people don't see why they should care that Kris is this random kid from Undertale that we barely even know about. Heck, we know so little that we practically never got the chance to get attached to them in the first place. But to me, that's kind of the point. In Undertale, the Science Soul was arguably given the worst odds to survive out of any human that fell in. Their weapon and armor are literally the weakest ones out of all 6, and if they were the first to fall after Kara, they didn't have the benefit of finding any of the other humans' stronger equipment as they went along either. They appear to have been the earliest to die, or at the very least made it the least far into the underground out of any human, given how their equipment is in the ruins and the first ones we find. And without having anywhere near the level of determination that Frisk had, they were basically doomed the moment they fell in. What's especially heartbreaking is that if this really was Kris, then they never even got to meet the Undertale counterparts of Noelle and Susie. We know for a fact that at least Noelle exists in Undertale, but the truth is that she probably never got to meet the patient soul. She might not even know that they existed. Entire relationships completely destroyed because they never even had the chance to begin. Because the patient soul's life never really had a chance to begin. They were dealt the crummiest hand out of anyone, barely given an opportunity to live. Even in the context of Undertale as a story, their character isn't given a fair shot to be remembered or live even in a narrative sense, as again, we don't really get to learn much about them at all. For reasons completely outside of their control, they're just about as inconsequential as you can possibly get, ultimately being not much more than a plot device to exacerbate tensions between humans and monsters, and just another human soul in the pile needed to break the barrier. In just about every single regard, Patience was never given a chance. But in Deltarune, they get that chance. They get the chance to grow up, to have a family, to make the friends they never got to make, to live their life, and to be the protagonist. Not just some random background character or someone who's just sacrificed and forgotten about, but the hero of the story. And isn't that what Deltarune is all about? A group of misfit teenagers who all in their own ways have gone beyond the boundaries of what we've expected from them, breaking the limits of what they're capable of and becoming more than what people see them as? Look, I know that it might not be the best theory out there, and I know that other theories might be a bit more fitting thematically, but even though I usually prefer the most narratively satisfying conclusion, for some reason, I still just think it's cool. Maybe it's because it recontextualizes both games and connects them in an interesting way. Maybe it's because I like the idea of this background character getting a second chance to shine. But whatever the reason is, even if there are better theories out there, I still think this one has merit. Because Deltarune being the story about a kid who never even got the chance to write their own in Undertale, I'm sorry, but I just can't help but think that that's awesome.